I have bought your book, the most recent one, anyway, and like Monsters and or Creatures of the Great Lakes. I haven't had a chance to read it, so I'm so sorry. I'm
It's
literally
okay.
back to the wall, just trying to get to this whole thing at the moment. So I'm in a new position in London, and it's a huge place, and 60 staff members, and writing a second book at the same time. So you know, uh, yeah, I'm not getting much reading time, but it looks so interesting. And because I love lake monsters, and I know that's not your only book, but because I love lake monsters, and I haven't really researched those areas, the Great Lakes, I thought, wow, come on, you've got to talk to Shetan and ask her
Yeah.
about this book. So let's just go into why that name, why those lakes, and what did you find?
So I live in Michigan, which is surrounded by the Great Lakes. And I have always had a fascination in the lake monsters. I know that we have them in the Great Lakes. And our historical reports go back to the earliest European settlers who decided to go fur trading along the lakes routes and would report back seeing different things. The Native Americans have told stories about these creatures since they started experiencing it. And so we have a lot of different reports, and we've got so many Great Lakes. We've got Michigan, or Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, Lake Superior, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and at one time Lake Champlain was even considered a sixth Great Lake.
Wow.
They've kind of dismissed that over the years, but these are big, huge, vast bodies of water that you can't necessarily see the other side of the lake from. And they are actually inland seas, freshwater seas, and they have the potential for lots of mysterious things to go on. Lake monsters being one, but shipwrecks, ghost ships being one, haunted lighthouses being another, devil's triangles, all of this phenomenon we
Wow.
have located here in the Great Lakes. So it's kind of like when Dorothy from Wizard of Oz says, if I ever want to go looking for adventure again, I don't have to go any further than my backyard. Well, that's pretty much it with the Great Lakes, except now that I own the Squatch GQ publishing magazine, I do kind of have to go out of my backyard because people kind of get bored reading about the Great Lakes. So I do tend to venture off into
Well,
into
that's
the
great though.
horizon
Yeah, that's fun.
and
That's stuff.
looking for new adventures and different
Yeah.
things to write about. But the Great Lakes are just they are so interesting, and just the phenomenon of the lake monsters alone. I still find reports to this day, and it's like I could really update the lake monster book, but that is kind of a bit of work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
I publish the 4 magazines quarterly, so that's quite a bit of work too.
Yeah, well, that's enough to be getting on with. I mean, here, Loch Ness, for example, would be our largest inland body of water, and that's only 24, 25 miles long, maybe a mile, mile and a half at its widest in some places. Yes, it's deep, 750 feet, they say. Loch Morar is deeper at about 1,000 feet, but still, this is a tiny body of water. Even when I was at Lake Champlain, 14 miles wide in some places, 100, was it 14 or 15 miles long?
128 miles long.
Oh, okay. So,
Lake
I
Champlain.
mean, and that's the smaller of the, not even included as one of the Great Lakes anymore.
Yeah, because
When I was looking at the map,
Lake
wait,
Superior is like 1,400 feet deep,
yes,
and
I mean,
or deeper in
amazing.
certain parts.
Yeah, amazing. And like you say, inland seas, actual inland seas that you can not see the other side of, and you can have diverse flora and fauna occupying without really coming to the attention of most people who even inhabit the lake and make their living upon it. What I'm interested in is the maybe the classic lake monsters in each one of those Great Lakes. Some of the classics and lesser known monsters. Let's start with Lake Michigan, for example.
Okay, so Lake Michigan For as big of a body of water as it is, the most well-known lake monster reports for Lake Michigan is actually two giant turtle reports. And these harken back to the size of like the prehistoric Archelon
Yeah.
turtle, which is
Wow.
bigger than most people's vehicles. He was 15 feet from the tip of his nose to the tip of his tail and 13 feet from flipper tip to flipper tip. And that was the average measurement, meaning that there could have been bigger or smaller specimens swimming out there in the waters. But these giant turtle reports, there's the Stearns Bayou monster, and then there's the Lake Leelanau monster. And so that is the major two with Lake Michigan. The scariest thing about Lake Michigan is the weather that develops on it, and the fact that Lake Michigan is notorious for riptides,
Oh.
and people swimming in the water, they don't necessarily understand that phenomenon happens with the way that Lake
Mhm.
Michigan is formed, and they're not prepared for when they do get caught up in a riptide. And we have multiple drownings a year because of
Mm.
the riptides, both on the Michigan side and the Illinois, Wisconsin side of Lake
Yeah.
Michigan. So it does have its two lake monster reports, the giant turtles, but really the riptides and the weather patterns that create the huge storms, those are even scarier than
Well,
any lake monster.
absolutely, absolutely. Actually, coming
Yeah.
from a part of the UK that has a lot of riptides, it's really amazing the power of those things, and
Oh, yes.
it can almost pull you out from the beach. I'm from waist height water. You can get just yanked out to
Yeah, and
sea. Uh,
that's
happens
what
really
happened
quickly.
in Lake Michigan. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. But I mean, as a body of water, to me, it was always very mysterious. But I was also thinking, and I think what you said sort of confirms this to me, when the body of water is too big, there seems to be more of a dearth in reports. And I would wonder, perhaps that doesn't mean that there aren't other types of unknown creatures there, but just that the space is so vast, they're not often seen.
Right. Right. But the interesting about Lake Michigan is that as it comes up around the state of Michigan, it goes into what's called the Straits of Mackinac, and then it turns into Lake Huron. And Lake
Uh,
Huron is a very fast moving body of water that turns into the Detroit River. And in that body of water, that portion of water, we have a plethora of sea serpent reports.
uh,
And that is what Lake Huron is most well known for, is sea serpent reports. Um, Being from 8 foot to 80 foot, different, colors, having gills, having sails down their back,
wow.
whiskers. But there's just a lot of different sea serpent reports in Lake Huron, and there is a clear channel that flows from Lake Michigan into Lake Huron, and it's actually one lake, but we like to divide them up into two, and so you would think that the reports that we get from Lake Huron, you would be seeing in Lake Michigan,
Mm.
but for some reason, the sea serpents like that faster moving body of water that actually travel southward, and they seem to be more present in that body of water than the east to west flowing water
Mm.
of Lake Michigan. So um, that one was always very interesting to me. That in this connected body of water, on one side you have giant turtles, on the other side you
Mm.
have giant sea serpents.
That's interesting. I wonder if that could act as a sort of a bottleneck, especially with the fast moving water to funnel the fish stocks, through. Maybe that's a preying
Well,
point, or
it's a very wide body of water, and that's the body of water that Mackinac Bridge goes over. So it's about
ah,
5 miles wide.
okay.
So it's a very large area. But the interesting thing is, as you're driving across Lake or Mackinac Bridge, and you're looking down into the water, it's very clear, and you could see if there was something large underneath the water moving around, because the waters in that area is a very aqua blue, very light blue. in that area. During the wintertime, they will get what they call the turquoise ice or the blue ice, and the ice, as it freezes over the top of the lakes right there, turns a really gorgeous shade of blue.
That's
And
amazing.
people, go up there just for that. They freeze their butts off, but they go up there just for that to look at that. Um, but it's a very clear body of water as you're looking down at it from a couple miles, like a mile in the air. Um, and if you've never driven off over Mackinac Bridge, it's one of those, you either can do it or you can't. And it's 5 miles long, and it's every time you go over it, you're like, okay, just keep going straight, just keep going straight.
Oh,
Um,
really? Is it
so
that high? How high is it then, the bridge?
it's pretty high. I
Yeah,
want to say it goes up at least a half mile above the water.
that's
Um,
wow. Okay,
and because
that's a huge bridge.
it's a very big bridge. It's one of the biggest suspension bridges in the world.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I would be with you. I'm obviously feeling a slight fear of heights there, and what you translate, you're giving over to me. We're on the same page. We were in the same room.
Yeah, I have
Uh,
a friend. I have a friend
yeah.
who she does not like driving over bridges. So um, at that point, she usually has somebody else drive. But I'm like, it's my car. I'm driving. So
I feel the same with everything. I mean, I have to do it sometimes, especially when we're out hiking and on little expeditions and stuff, and even a small climb from time to time. And I'm very uncomfortable with it. And I do it because there's people with me. If it's just me, I just no. I do it out of to conceal my shame and fear calmly while they're watching me. Now, I mean, that's quite amazing actually, and I think a lot of people wouldn't really understand the scale. So the smaller aspect of this lake is 5 miles across.
right, and
Yeah,
that's the Straits of Mackinac that
yeah,
flow from
okay,
Lake Michigan to Lake Huron.
wow. And in this country, we just don't have any concept of that kind of distance with water. Yeah, we just don't have it inland water because we don't have that kind of space. We don't have that
Right.
kind of area to investigate. And I think a lot of people have got to see that, at least conceive of the possibility that within such a vast space, and as you said, 1,400 feet deep in some places, it would be almost impossible to fully explore, the
Oh yeah,
available.
Lake Superior is she has her own set of rules of engagement.
Mm,
I will just say that. Um, She has quite a few lake monster reports, including the great underwater panther Inabishu from Native American legends. But
mm,
there are stories of giant sturgeon being 40 foot long in that lake. There's a weird creature called Pressy that is supposed to be serpentine, but also turtle-like. Um, I haven't seen that one. I usually focus on uh, the great underwater panther Inabishu for Lake Superior, and we have a merman report from Lake Superior around the Pie Island area, and that is the great Manitou Nibba, the god of the lake.
wow.
And so those to me are more interesting because the Native Americans talk about them. They're part of their storytelling and folklore. And what I have found in researching, um, pretty much since I was like 15 years old, so that's over 20 years, over 40 years actually, is that behind every piece of folklore legend, every urban tale, every story, there is somewhere a grain of truth in a proven
Yeah.
fact. And people came up with an explanation or a story for something because of something they witnessed themselves. And
Mm,
whether it was a moose that was swimming, through the water, or a cougar or something unexpected, people notice these things and they try to explain it in the best of their knowledge. without, the scientific data that we have today.
Absolutely.
One, one
Absolutely.
of the interesting things I found out when I was writing my lake monster book is that North American moose will dive up to 20 feet underwater to eat underwater vegetation.
Really?
And
That's
if
interesting.
they explode up onto the surface
Mm.
and you happen to be kayaking or canoeing past them when they do this, well, moose aren't that happy to see human beings when they're on land. So you can
Mm.
imagine how they react in the water. So that gives the impression of a lake monster. When you look at the details of, well, it had a horse-like head and uh, horns coming out of its head, a spiky coat, seaweed
Yeah.
and algae all over it. And then you find this gem of a fact that, yeah, moose will seal their nostrils shut and dive underwater to eat the underwater vegetation, and
I
then
never knew that. I never knew
they pop back up
that.
and finish eating it, and they will do this repeatedly until they've had their full. And we also know this because orcas have been found with fully intact moose in their stomachs.
Wow. Wow. But
So,
do orcas manage
I
to
think,
get into those lakes? Is there a sea access to them?
well, so not in the Great Lakes area,
Ah,
but moose are the northern part of North America, going from like the northern United States into Canada,
yeah.
both
Okay.
on the East Coast and West Coast, you have moose. So in Maine, going up into like Nova Scotia, and then going, towards British Columbia and Alaska, even Washington, you have moose and you have orcas in those areas. And
That
if
makes,
the
yeah.
moose is swimming through the sound trying to get from one body of water to the other, well, if it's in the orcas, domain, then
That's a
the
good
orcas are going
meal
to
for
eat it.
a pot of orchids. Absolutely. No, I mean that's fine. For a moment there, I had a hopeful thought there was some sort of sea access to those lakes, and as a as an explanation for itinerant sea monsters and things like that, I brightened up. I had this illumination suddenly,
I think
but no.
Lake Ontario might be the only one that has a saltwater access. But
Okay.
with most of the Great Lakes, any bodies of water that flow into them, like the Mississippi River, the Illinois River,
Mm.
the St. Lawrence Causeway, they have locks and dams in place
Ducks and
because
dams. Yeah.
we've gotten an infestation of Asian carp
Okay.
in the Mississippi River and the Illinois River. And so they don't want those silver carp or those Asian carp getting into the Great Lakes,
Got
because
it.
once that happens, though they are vegetarians and they eat the algae, they eat the seaweed. Well, once all that's eaten up and gone, the fish fry, the sports fishing fry, the baby fish have nowhere to hide
Hmm.
and are picked off by other predatory fish, birds, frogs, whatever. And if that happens for more than two generations, well, your sports fishing population in the Great Lakes is
Of
gone.
course. That's
And
it.
there's no really replacing it, because in order to encourage further generations, you would have to totally eliminate the Asian carp population. That would become overwhelming because they breed very well. They are quite a sizable fish, and the only thing they eat is the vegetation. So that
Mm.
would have a massive detrimental effect on any of the Great Lakes.
It's interesting to me. I mean, we're in that stage now where aren't we, in the world, or at least our countries, in the world where in introduced species, especially
Invasive
sports
species, yes.
introductions, these species that are introduced to our countries, and Britain is a really good example of species that have been introduced. Many people now accept as being just regular species like the grey squirrel and the Canada goose that have decimated local
Yes.
populations. So we only have red squirrels now in the very north of England and Scotland. That's it. I remember seeing red squirrels in Wales where I grew up when I was a child. So it's just a recent thing. The bigger and stronger variant comes in. I think we've also got a problem here, at least in the Thames and some other places, with the Chinese mitten crab. They go
Okay.
into all of the rivers and they burrow into the riverbanks, and it makes them less secure. So yeah, gosh, that kind of stuff happens all the time, and it's a shame. What I think is very Very interesting about that moose theory, though. I like that. But at the same time, going back to your First Nations legends and folklore and beliefs, it's hard for me to believe that even in that situation, that somebody local to that environment who would have lived closer to animals than we live now would be fooled by such a
Well,
surprise sighting.
you have to put them yourself in their mindset that their their explanations for things came from their shamans and their chieftains, and their canoes were they were dug out canoes, so weighted down with pelts or copper or anything else that they had gone and
Mm.
foraged. These canoes probably would have only been a couple of inches above the water's surface,
Okay.
and they would have kept the lake shore within sight, because if a big storm came up, and they
Hmm.
believed that the great underwater panther Invasive would send the storms to drown them, because one of the Native American beliefs is if you took an ounce more of anything that you needed, that was considered
Okay.
greed, and the lake monsters would take back what you took.
Oh,
And that
really?
had the justification for sinking your boat and drowning your crew. So they were very, very, I don't want to say, because superstitious is a European, American
Wow.
type, mentality, but the Native Americans were very cautious of this
Yeah.
and always worried that, did we take too much? Are we going to be in trouble with the lake monsters or any of the Manitous?
Mm.
And to be paddling along and suddenly have this animal, and moose are huge.
Yeah, well, absolutely
They're the size of
terrifying. Yeah.
Nebraska.
Yeah.
And so to have this huge animal explode out of the water next to you and break the surface of the water, and you're not expecting that, and
Mm.
you see this animal with seaweed hanging off of its, you know, antlers, and its fur covered in algae or seaweed, and it's eating algae, and it's pawing the water and thrashing the water, you're going to get as far away from that animal as you can, as fast as you can, and you're not gonna, you're gonna look back to make
Oh,
sure that you got away from it. But by then, either the animal has swam out of the lake and is on lakeshore and gone back into the woods, or it's dove back under the water to eat more vegetation because the threat of humans is gone. And you're going to paddle away as fast as you can, hoping that you never see that. And all it takes is one encounter like that, and for the tribes, the men to get back to the rest of the tribe and to tell the chieftain that, the shaman that spreads through the whole camp. And then every time you meet a new Native American tribe, you give them this tale of warning of be careful when you cross this lake,
mm.
because there's this creature in it, and word of mouth travels very
Well,
fast.
there's even examples. Sorry, isn't there of the First Nations people telling the European settlers, "Be careful because
Yeah,
X, Y, and Z on the lake." And I think that's when this is a cautionary tale that's based upon some sort of incident or
right.
incidents. It would make sense, I think, as well if you have an animistic or nature-based belief, and you take a little too much out of that, or you traverse some of those precepts of religious,
Mhm.
rights and wrongs, and then so let's say you do take a bit too much copper or whatever you do, and it sinks your boat. Well, I mean, that's going to be interpreted
Yes.
as the gods
That's going to
punished
be
you.
an explanation given
Hmm.
when you don't return after a period of time. That's
Yeah,
going to be the explanation that the tribe comes up with for why you didn't return. And
yeah,
whether it was a natural occurring event where a storm came along and sunk the canoe, or
yeah,
they did take too much, and the canoe starts taking on water and they can't either swim or paddle fast enough to shore.
yeah.
Um, you know, when they encounter riptides or stuff like that, this is all explained away by, well, they must have angered the lake monster.
Do you think
And by
this is
doing
like a
so,
coping mechanism as well? In the same way that we cope with things now, and especially in those archaic times where life isn't fair and it isn't always just accidents
right,
happen, bad things happen. and then you have to explain it through some religious doctrine. Oh, it's because they sinned against the gods in some way, or the spirits of the lake. That
Right,
must have been it. It's not just because life is horribly unfair and they just were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And
right.
these things can then grow up around it. And I've noticed that in places like Alaska. I've even noticed it in waterhorse, like Kelpie um, myths of Scotland and Ireland with the Pierce, where they're said to have, invited children to play on their backs, and then they dive into the water and
Right.
drown them. This is clearly a coping mechanism, in my view, for a parent that's not watched that child, and then the child is drowned because they got too close to the water. And well, it must have been the water kelpie. It must have been the Pierce that
Right.
dragged them in. You know, it's interesting how universal that is. In all cultures all around the world.
Yeah, it and we find different stories. Now the great underwater panther or lynx or dragon, as depends on what tribe you talk to, is what I call or what I put into the group of the amalgamations, and that is creatures that have a lot of natural details, like the horns, like the fur or scales, horse-like head or dragon-like head, but it's all these different elements put together, and most of them come from Native American tales. So in Lake Superior, you've got the great underwater panther Inabishu. Lake Ontario, you've got Kingsley. You've also got Onair. You've also got Gassendia. In Lake Huron area, you've got a creature called Carcagna, and they are all, part of tales of warning of, if you don't heed the natural warnings, then this is what's going to happen. So, like with Onair, if you see fog coming and you hear the wind howling, it's said that Onair, who can appear in two different forms, is coming and is warning you to stay off the lake. And if you don't heed his warning, well, you get lost in one of the storms. And but Onair did give you the warning. Gassendi is said to be a meteor dragon that flies around the lake surface and dives underwater, and was
Oh,
seen by the French explorer Jacques Cartier and his men, and it was documented, as being blue with an orange flame
oh,
engulfing it. And no matter if he was above the water, in the air, or in the water, he was, surrounded in this flame at all times. Kingsley is from Kingston, Ontario, and was said to be a dragon type, creature that swam through the water, and was seen so often that boat captains decided they were going to catch him. And fortunately, their plan never worked, because I don't think it would have turned out very well. One captain had like a dog kennel on top of his
yeah.
deck. Another had like a steel crane with a noose to winch
Okay.
him out of the water. And the third captain got barrels of hops and mash and sailed around Kingston and dumped the hops and mash into the water, hoping to get Kingsley drunk. And
Wow. Oh
um,
wow.
killed off everything else in the water, but they were never able to capture
Yeah.
Kingsley.
Yeah. I mean the fish were absolutely wasted, I'm guessing, but yeah,
Yeah,
not the beast itself. It's interesting to me. I think it's very interesting that there's such universality of traditional explanations for lake monsters, for the dangers of water as
right.
well. But the other thing on top of that always brings me back into this belief that there could be something there is the modern day sightings, these inexplicable, very descriptive sightings that happen. So do you have anything like that for the Great Lakes, things that happened in the
Yeah.
last
So,
10 or so years?
so in Lake Erie, there have been plesiosaur reports going back to the first settlers along the Lake Erie shoreline. And one of the ones that stands out to me the most, it happened, I believe, in like the 1970s, and um, could be earlier, but there was a pastor and his wife who had gone over to one of their church members' house, and they were helping her set up in the backyard to do a Bible study. And they observed what they assumed was the hull of a boat being washed towards the beach with the waves. And they thought that a boat had wrecked and overturned. So they immediately started calling out across the water, is anybody out there? Does anybody need any help? They started calling for help, running up and down the shoreline, trying to see if there was any survivors. And then all of a sudden, the object that they thought was the hull of a boat that had been slowly moving in towards the shore abruptly started moving against the current very quickly, very powerfully away from them, and then dove underneath the water. And they believe that that is the creature that they call Bessie. Everything rhymes with Nessie.
Yes.
That one just, the only one that doesn't is Champ and Ogopogo. Everything else, we got to rhyme this with, there's Tessie, there's Nessie, there's Pressy, there's
it's the same between Storzy and all the rest of these things. Well, I mean, look, that's the infamous sighting, and I suppose that other creatures would be named in emulation of it. It has something to do with local, well, for newspaper headlines, of course, to sell those, and perhaps local tourism in some ways as well. Yeah, you want to remind people of that cryptozoological gold mine that's still paying out to this very day.
Some places they don't really take advantage of it. So, like with Loch Ness, that Nessie is one of the biggest attractions there. But here you've got Lake Champlain with its own lake monster that's been documented for a century or more, and it's really not promoted. And you've only got a few places that really even acknowledge the Champ phenomenon. Port Henry does the Champ Festival, and has some different areas around the small town where you can take pictures and stuff like that. There is the Echo Center in Burlington, Vermont, that has a very small exhibit to Champ. And then there's just a few things here or there that really even show that. I stopped at the Champ outpost that last June when I was there, and they only had one coffee mug with Champ on it, and I was like, "That you're called the Champ Outpost? That's all you have?" And they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, they had more maple syrup in stock than they did Champ stuff, and I was like,
a lot of maple syrup. It shocked me when I went there actually to Lake Champlain, and that's the only one of those big lakes I've been to, and I only went there for a few days back in 2018, and I kept saying to people, you've got a huge thing here that you can take advantage of, and you're not doing it. I went to that. I think they had a lot more at the Champ Outpost when I went there, because I even got a Champ umbrella for my daughters that they still use.
Okay. Yeah, they didn't have. I was there at the beginning of June, and I'm like, really? Are you getting more stuff in? It's like, no. I found more Champ stuff at the Echo Center, the museum there, and the gift shop than I found anywhere else around Lake Champlain. And you would talk to people like, so have you heard any Champ reports? And they're like, what's that?
What? Yeah, exactly. Well, I've got a theory on that, though. I've got a theory on why that is. And I think the reason is because the whole lake itself is a very, very popular and busy pleasure boating body of water. And there's already business. That's the point. And the business is pleasure boating and fishing and whatever else people do, and holidaying around the lake. We've got a lake here called Lake Windermere in the north of England that has its own Nessie-like creature called Bow Nessie. But it's also the Lake District in the north of England, Cumbria. It's beautiful. It's a super popular hiking area, B&Bs and hotels and pleasure boating on the lake. And when we went there, and I've interviewed various witnesses who've seen this creature and asked the local people in the town, we thought, let's just get a mic out and a camera, ask them if they know about it. Nobody knew about it. No one.
Oh, wow.
And one of the captains that rented boats out on the lake said, yeah, I've heard of that and blah, blah, blah. But, it's kind of rare and we don't really talk of it that much here. They had they already had the money they needed. The business existed, and I think that's, for me, from a cursory glance of the area, that's the reason for the lack of champ exploitation.
Right.
I mean, you know better than me. I was there for a tiny time, but yeah, it would make sense to me anyway.
Yeah, and one of the things. So, as a travel writer and somebody who has the magazines, one of the things that I love is when a town or a city celebrates their small town monsters, and
Yeah,
I want to see like it on every street corner, and gift shops, and just overwhelm me with the cryptozoology. And there's only Point Pleasant with Mothman. They really celebrate Mothman. Rylander, Wisconsin with the Hodag, even though that
right.
is a fake creature that somebody
Hmm.
created. The town celebrates it. There's Hodags on every corner. They've got gift shops, with Hodag stuff. They have the parades for it, and it's just like I love it when a town embraces what makes them unique and really celebrates it. And that's like
Right. Yeah.
Loch Ness is on my bucket list. I'm trying to like because every May they do the marine reptile symposium
Mhm.
there in Dorset.
Yes, yes. That's in Lyme Regis. Is that right?
Yeah, Lyme Regis.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
So
town. It's such a fossil treasure trove there. I love
and
that
and
town.
that's on my bucket list
Yeah.
is to put up or set up a trip that I can do the marine reptile
Oh yeah.
symposium, go fossil hunting there, and they also have, I guess they have ghost tours there too. So definitely hit
I mean,
those up,
there's ghost tours everywhere in Britain.
and then travel up to Ireland and Scotland, and
Yeah.
go to all that. And so that's always been for the past, well, before COVID hit, that was like on my bucket list to do. And then it was like, nope, they canceled. Nope, they canceled. Nope. So like everything hinges on if they're going to run the marine, prehistoric marine
I think
reptiles.
they will this time. I think they will this time. That town, Lyme Regis, I've been there several times. And Dorset is the Jurassic Coast, as you know.
Yes.
And I've seen like a completely fully assembled juvenile plesiosaur specimen in windows. There's shops that just are selling fossils that have been
Yep.
found on the beaches and some reconstructions. And it's a beautiful, actually, it's a very well-to-do town. It's very rich and it's very nice. The whole area there, Dorset's
And
beautiful anyway.
they also have a museum there that has
Mm.
a lot of the prehistoric marine reptiles too. And that's like, I could spend the whole day in there just
Oh yeah.
uh, gaping in awe at, oh, look at that one, and taking
Mm.
pictures. And, I'm a person who has to like, take 30 pictures of the
Oh
same thing.
yeah.
I think make sure I have like the perfect angle when it goes into my magazines. And that's just
I
because I have written and done journalism so long that it's like
yeah.
you never rely on just getting one picture. You get as many as you can from
No, of
different angles.
course.
You never know which one's going to look best.
You
Or
never know, and what you see in the viewfinder isn't always what comes out
right.
in the edit later. Yeah, I mean, especially for me. Um, there was a joke made the other day actually when I was filming something completely innocuous, went on my Facebook page, that it was typical that somebody who searches for Bigfoot should have such a shaky hand when holding a camera. And if I go out normally, I use like a stabilizer or something just because it's so. And I thought, yeah, that isn't that funny. That would automatically anything I grabbed without a stabilizer would be blurry. Yeah, I mean, you would love. Sorry, get comfy here. You would love Dorset. You'd love that whole area. Wales as well, where I grew up. All of the cliffs around there have more ammonites and other things in the fossils. Although a new type of dinosaur was found there not so long ago. My sister, who's a fossil
Yeah.
hound, found a few ichthyosaur vertebrae as well
Oh,
on the
cool.
beach. And I think there was a new sort of raptor found by a boy just walking the beach with his mum and found this thing in some rocks, and it's in the museum now. It's amazing. So there's that. Loch Ness you should definitely do, but also Loch Morar at the same time.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, That's because it's completely clear. The water's clear there, whereas Loch Ness, it's completely peat filled. You can't see anything,
Right.
and you would literally need a breach before to really capture anything at all, which does happen to some people. I've been there a few times. It's never happened to me. I sat right next to that lake at night for hours and hours and hours, and realized actually it's so pristine there and so dark that even with the little tourists the spots around, I couldn't see the creature if it was right in front of my face. That's how dark it is.
Right.
There's no light pollution at all. Even I think the most populated village around the loch, which is Fort Augustus, has only 500 permanent residents.
Oh, okay.
And this is, I think this is a place that sees something like 300,000 or 400,000 visitors a year. And it's actually really tiny, very rural. And Loch Morar is even worse. I think there's 2 tiny villages, and half the loch you can't even access from anything but a boat anyway. So it's a nice, quiet place to research. Yeah, you should definitely do it. Let's talk about sea serpents around
Okay.
the United States and in Canada. Things like Caddy and Cassie and all these different things. What's your view on them?
So with the sea serpent phenomenon, the one thing you have to keep in mind is anything that is northern. So from the Great Lakes up, these are cold bodies of water.
Mm.
They do not warm up, and it's very hard for anything that is reptilian and snake-like to stay active in these waters, because even in August, which is our hottest month here in the
Okay.
United States, the water is only comfortable, let's say. I'm not even, because it never gets bathtub warm. But so in August, you could probably, like on Lake Michigan, you could probably wade out to your knees. It'd be relatively comfortable. But when you get out to your chest, you start noticing a change in the water's temperature. Anything deeper than that, and you're starting to really feel the cold effects of the water.
Okay.
And it's just because we have ice. The Great Lakes do freeze over, and there's icebergs in them. And there's been times where there's still ice going into late June in
Wow.
the Great Lakes, in the middle of the lake. I've been up in the UP of Michigan, driving through on Memorial Day weekend and seeing huge ice sheets out in the middle of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior.
Gosh.
And we're talking, you could see it from like 2 miles away on
I mean,
shoreline.
we talking big icebergs here, or sort of
Yeah.
ice on the water?
No, we're talking like 12 feet of ice and snow sticking out of the water, and at least a quarter mile long.
Wow.
So that's how cold these bodies of water are.
So this is like a hypothermia risk for a human, basically.
Yes. So smaller lakes that can warm up in the summer heat, you might be getting large snakes swimming through it, or eel type, looking fish, long bodied fish. If it's a fish, then yes, I say that you could probably mistake some, like the burbot and stuff like that, as a sea serpent if it's swimming at the surface of the water and just its back is breaking the water. And especially if there's a line of them or a school of them that are swimming along together, that could give you the impression of a sea serpent. But in the northern, United States going into Canada, even though we do get the sea serpent reports, unless it's like a 3-foot diameter creature that's, 40 feet long or more, it's probably not going to last too long in the Great Lakes, just because our only warm months for the water would be June, July, August, somewhat going into September, and then it starts to cool back off because even in late September, October, we have what's called the gales of November, which is the storms, but those start showing up in late September and October, and certainly have made their presence known throughout the history of the Great Lakes.
So could this great size then, do you think that could be a compensation for the cold, perhaps?
It could be. I mean, we definitely know that there were, like with the plesiosaurs and the mosasaurs, we do know that there were cold temperature species that could exist just like whales in the colder temperatures.
Yeah.
But for any type of snake, anything that sustains for under 50 degrees, they start to shut down. And if you're in a body of water, you never warm up. And so if you're cold, you're only going to get colder. And so that's why some of the lake monster reports or sea serpent reports that we've gotten in the Great Lakes have actually turned out to be boa constrictors or types of python and anacondas that people have released into the water and thinking that, they'll do fine. And it's like, no. They
do
even
they go into a state of
alligator
torpor when that happens, or do they just die?
Sometimes they do, they get onto land and they can find, because on land, we do have natural occurring species of snakes. Our biggest being the Mississauga, the eastern rattlesnake. And they do survive quite well on land. We do have water snakes, but they are small snakes. And by the time the wind, the cold starts happening, they are finding their hibernation spots, and they're done. But for these, sea serpents to be in the water, they would only be in there during the winter month, or the summer month. And it would have to be when the ice is clear. There's another phenomenon that we have in the Great Lakes, and that is that along the shorelines of the Great Lakes, we have these ice boulders that form, and the waves hitting against the shoreline round these, and you've got like a 10-foot path of these ice boulders slamming against the shore.
Wow.
So, and then the rest of the lake is frozen over. So that's not a hospitable place for anything that's an air breather to try to stake out a living. It's even worse if you're somebody who's, trying to get off the lakes, and you hit that swatch right there where it's the ice boulders, and you're going to get battered with those things.
Wow. I mean, this is always the thing that comes up with Lake Champlain, and clearly these lakes as well, is where do these, since they're inland, they're not necessarily connected to the sea for the most part, where do these creatures go in the winter if they are reptiles, if they need to hide, or what type of reptiles are they? Are we assuming that they're cold-blooded?
Right.
Could there be a possibility that they are warm-blooded animals? But even then, how do they keep themselves warm in such terrible conditions? I know people like Scott Marlis used to talk about the humps being fat reserves or some sort of ballast, but it was also talked about as a fat reserve at one point.
Right.
Are these their survival tools for that environment? And that was very interesting to me, because it seemed to at least bring a reason and a purpose, theoretically, to what the humps could represent, especially since most of the sightings we have in the northern hemisphere are in cold bodies of water, whether they freeze or not. That's interesting to me. Do you think there's a possibility that there could be a reptile that's a surviving relic of some kind, and also warm-blooded, and
we do know,
able to wait out the
So we
winters?
do know that so we do have American alligators and crocodiles here in the United States because so many people have gotten crocodiles as pets and then released them.
Yeah,
We now have a breeding population here in the United States, but we do know that there's alligators as far north as the Ohio River, which
really?
does freeze over. But the crocodiles, when the water starts to freeze up, what they will do is they will come to just barely the surface of the water and they will stick their snouts up.
Wow.
And as long as they can breathe, they go into a process called brumination. And their heartbeats slow down to, I think, 1 beat for every 2 minutes.
Wow.
And this
Amazing.
actually happens in Africa too. There's certain times where you can actually cross the rivers without fear of the crocodiles because when it gets cold in Africa and they go into this almost like hibernative state in
Yeah.
reptiles, that's what the brumination is. It's a hibernated state. They go almost like into a induced trance, and
Ah,
they can stay underwater in Africa. In North America, they will actually come up to the water surface, and people go out on the Ohio rivers and they say it's the damnedest thing to see a frozen body of water and hear all these alligator snouts sticking out of it.
I have seen a picture of
And
that actually, and I remember thinking, really, is this possible? Surely the
yeah,
creature just freezes to death, and but no,
no,
this.
no, they slow down their heart rates
Wow.
to compensate for that. And because it's a river, um, it only freezes over if it gets really extremely cold. And then once warm water, from industrial sites or stuff starts moving through the river system, that breaks apart the ice and unthaws it, and then they can go swimming away. But
Okay.
yes, so it is possible for large reptilian aquatic creatures to preserve themselves in cold bodies of water, but they have to be able to breathe and get that oxygen.
Mm,
So as long as they can do that, then they're fine. As long as they have a good fat store or deposit on their bodies or in their bodies, then they can sustain on that, and then they can find a warm place to haul out and sun themselves, warm themselves back up, and they're just fine. Snakes are a little bit more delicate, more vulnerable
mm.
because they don't have that hard exterior to protect them. With
Uh-huh.
a snake, if they get cut by the ice or anything like that, they have to find a place where they can stay long enough to heal. And if they get cut too deep, then they're probably not going to heal from it.
That, I mean, that makes sense to me. And I mean, I don't believe that these serpentine creatures in the Great Lakes are snakes anyway, are they? Well, just finally before we finish up, what, where does your personal preference lie? Do you think we're looking at, amphibians of some kind, or are we looking at some sort of reptile
I,
that's
I,
managed to
I
survive in these conditions?
I think with the sea serpents as a category, this, what people were probably seeing was different specimens of either a group of long-bodied fish
Mhm.
or different types of freshwater eels that, due to human encroachment, they possibly have died out over the years.
Mm.
Um, but I believe that it is a aquatic species that is very, native to the Great Lakes and can withstand the super cold, icy temperatures that our lakes get.